What's something your parents believe that you don't?
By the time the plates hit the table and the server asked who wanted coffee, I already knew the night was drifting away from me, and I do not mean in the dramatic way people use when they want sympathy. I mean in the practical, familiar way when family gathers and somehow the person who is supposed to be centered ends up orbiting someone louder, which in my case has always been my brother Jake, who has perfected the art of arriving late, talking over people, and timing announcements like he is running a halftime show. Here is the hook, and I am not dressing it up because it does not need dressing up. At my graduation dinner, after years of working 2 jobs and taking night classes and saying no to things other people my age just say yes to, my brother stood up, raised his glass, and said he had just bought a house, then smirked and said, "Guess that tops a diploma," and the table burst into that warm, rolling laugh people do when they are relieved to have something to be excited about that feels bigger than whatever you were celebrating, and I sat there with my napkin folded and my smile steady, while my stomach did that small drop you get when the elevator jerks. If this sounds petty, it is not, and if it sounds like I am jealous, I am not, because this is not about square footage or how many bedrooms or what the yard looks like. This is about the way one sentence can erase a year of effort. The way one smirk can tell you the scoreboard was changed while you were still tying your shoes, and the way certain people, especially in families like mine where cheerleading is not evenly distributed, learn to treat your milestones like warm-ups for theirs. I watched the faces I know better than any streaming show. My dad doing the proud head nod he reserves for Jake and for sports highlights. My mom clasping her hands and asking a lot of questions about closing costs she never once asked me about tuition. My uncle throwing in a joke about property taxes that landed better than any joke about late-night study sessions ever landed, and I realized that I could either sit there and pretend this felt fine, or I could keep my mouth shut now and pick a smarter moment to put my own flag in the ground, because one thing I have learned grinding through school while handling rent and bills is that timing beats volume every single time. So I lifted my glass and congratulated him, and I kept my voice light and kind because I do not want to be the bitter sister in anyone's story, and I said something like, "That is great, Jake. Maybe you can teach me how to top all my hard work with one signature," which got a few chuckles and one cough and a glance from my aunt who hears more than she lets on, and then I pivoted to thanking everyone for coming for me, for the texts during finals and the rides when my car died and the patience when I said no to holidays so I could work shifts, all of it true and none of it dramatic, and while I was talking, Jake leaned back in his chair the way he always does when he thinks the show is over. And that was when I understood the part of me that had changed during these years people thought I was just buried in textbooks. Finishing a degree while balancing a job does not make you a saint. It just trains your brain to stop chasing every argument and start selecting the ones worth your oxygen. So when the laughter died down and the server started slicing the cake that my mom rushed to rename Jake's house cake, which would have been funny if it were not so on brand, I decided to give myself one small, clean win before the night ended. Not a blow-up, not a scene. Just a line that would plant itself in the right soil and grow by morning. I clinked my spoon against my glass, not hard, just enough to call eyes back for a second, and I said, "Truly, Jake, congratulations, and thank you too to Mom and Dad for believing in both of us. Because without their signatures, neither of us would be sitting here tonight bragging about big steps," which slid across the table like a polite shrug to anyone who was not paying attention and landed like a tiny dart for anyone who has ever co-signed something they later pretend was someone else's solo achievement. And I watched the quick flicker between my parents and my brother, just a heartbeat. Nothing a stranger would care about, but enough for me to file away as yes, I did not imagine that. No one argued, because my tone gave them no reason, and the conversation moved on to paint colors and yard work and whether Jake would host Thanksgiving, and I nodded and chewed and laughed where appropriate. And while they planned holidays in a house I had not been invited to step into yet, I scrolled quietly through my phone under the table, not to doom scroll or to complain, just to check one thread I keep for myself. The one with screenshots and emails and a note from a conversation I Overheard when Jake thought I could not hear, a thread that reminded me of the loan terms and the inspection deadline and the zoning notice I had read twice, because I read everything twice now, and I felt my pulse settle into that calm, slow beat that shows up right before you take a test you know you prepared for. I will not pretend I did not want to say more in the moment, because I did. I wanted to ask why my work is only impressive until Jake walks in. I wanted to ask why the family group chat claps louder for mortgages than for degrees that took years. I wanted to point out the part where Jake has never carried anything alone and I have been carrying myself for a long time. But I have also learned that saying things to make yourself feel better in the moment is a cheap victory that costs you leverage later, and if this night taught me anything, it is that I am done spending my leverage on temporary relief. When the check came, I asked the server to split it and I paid my part without flinching, even when my dad tried to do that fatherly wave and take it back, because I wanted the paper trail clean. And when we hugged goodnight and everyone did another round of congratulations for the homeowner who had stolen my spotlight without even breaking a sweat, I kissed my mom's cheek, told my dad I would call him tomorrow, and told Jake, with a smile that never slipped, that I was happy for him and that I would have an announcement of my own in the morning, something small but meaningful, and he laughed like I had made a cute joke and said he could not wait. I got in my car, sat quietly for a minute, and let the noise drain out, not to cry or to stew, just to hear my own thoughts, and when I finally drove home I knew two things with absolute clarity. The first being that I was not going to let this become another story where I swallow it and move on, and the second being that I already knew exactly which words, lined up in the right order at the right time, would shift the center of gravity back to me without yelling or begging or asking anyone's permission, because I had watched this family long enough to understand what they hear and what they ignore. And that is why, when I set my phone on the nightstand and closed my eyes, I was not replaying Jake's smirk anymore. I was counting the hours until morning and picturing the exact moment my notification would go live. Because if he wanted to turn my night into his performance, then tomorrow I would turn his performance into my setup, and I promise you, I was about to make good on that, starting with a line that sounds polite, reads harmless, and hits exactly where it should. I woke up before my alarm not because I was eager to face the day, but because my brain does what it always does after a family event, which is replay every comment with the volume turned up on the parts that stung and the captions turned on for the parts nobody said out loud, and as I lay there staring at the ceiling and trying not to spiral, I kept thinking about how last night was not an accident or a one-off. It was the latest chapter in a pattern I have known since middle school when Jake forgot a project at home, and my mom drove 40 minutes to deliver it while I learned to accept that if I forgot something I would be learning a different lesson about responsibility. And how in high school he clipped a neighbor's mailbox and my dad handled the repair and the apology, while I learned that if I made a mess I was going to be the one scrubbing it, and later when I got my first small scholarship and tried to celebrate. The group chat suddenly lit up because Jake's band had booked a bar on a Thursday, and we all needed to go support dreams, which is noble when people actually support everyone's dreams and not just the ones that come with loud headlines and easy photos. If it sounds like I am trying to paint myself as some kind of martyr, I am not, because the truth is I like being the one who knows how to hold things together. It suits me, and there is a certain freedom in not waiting for rescue plans that never arrive. But there is also a quiet anger that builds when people treat your grit like wallpaper while they treat someone else's impulse as a mural, and that anger can make you reckless if you let it sit too long without a plan. So I got up, made coffee, and told myself that today was not about lashing out. Today was about correcting the record with the same politeness people use when they erase you, because I have learned that the only thing more effective than a clapback is a correction that sounds like a toast. The thing I had tossed on the table last night like a harmless ribbon, that line about signatures, was not an accident, and it was not petty either. It was context, and the context is simple. That house was not a solo climb. It did not appear because Jake is some financial wizard. It exists because our parents co-signed after a shaky pre-approval, and they did it partly out of love and partly out of habit. The habit of smoothing his road because he keeps finding gravel. And I know this not Because I am nosy, but because I was at the kitchen table 3 months ago when my mom asked me to help her scan a form and did not realize the copy machine spits a preview. And I watched her hands shake a little when she said she hoped he would finally settle down and stop buying toys he cannot insure, and I swallowed the lecture I wanted to give because I am not their parent. And the best way to prove a point in a family like mine is not to argue it, but to let it prove itself. There is a second layer too, and it matters because it is where the leverage lies, and leverage is not a dirty word in my world anymore. It is what you use when shouting does not work. And the second layer is that the house sits in an area where the city has been sniffing around for zoning changes tied to a public works plan that sounds generous in the brochure, but reads like headaches if you have a mortgage and a fragile ego. And I know this because I read the same public notices everyone else can read, and because a friend from work forwarded a community board email that mentioned increased inspections for certain blocks. And I also know that Jake knows some of this, because I heard him in our parents' living room on speaker with a bank person using that careful customer service tone about an upcoming appraisal and whether certain repairs were considered cosmetic or structural. And he told them it was no big deal while tapping his foot hard enough to shake the lamp, and I logged it away the way you log away expiration dates in your fridge, not to weaponize it for cruelty, but to protect yourself from someone else's rotten narrative. So when I say I had a plan for a morning announcement, I do not mean drama for drama's sake. I mean a pivot that would reframe the conversation without me raising my voice or asking anyone to pick a side. And to build that pivot, I did the small things first. The small things people dismiss as petty while they underestimate how fast small things add up, like updating my LinkedIn with a line about accepting an offer that had been sitting in my inbox waiting for me to graduate, which was real and earned and would look clean when family did their inevitable social media rounds, and like preparing a short post for my Facebook that would sound cheerful and supportive and would, if read by anyone with basic reading comprehension, steer attention to a context people conveniently ignored last night, and like drafting a text to my aunt who keeps her ear to the ground about neighborhood issues, a text that read as curiosity about community meetings and nothing more. Because curiosity is not a crime, but it can be contagious. I am telling you this because I want you to understand that I was not trying to destroy my brother. I was trying to stop him from stepping on my neck while everyone clapped for his shoes, and in families like mine, the only way to do that without starting a war you cannot finish is to make the truth obvious to people who would rather ignore it, which means you cannot rant, you cannot accuse, you cannot flail. You have to thread the needle and make them witness the thing they claim not to see. And yes, that takes longer than a satisfying shouting match, but it works, and when it works you do not have to explain yourself, you just have to smile while other people connect the dots. So I took that first small swing, not with a scream but with a tap, and I opened the family group chat where the previous night's photos were piling up with comments about how grown up we all are. And I dropped a tidy message that said I had been thinking all night about how lucky Jake and I are to have parents who back their kids even when the stakes are big, and how their signatures and support and stubborn belief have gotten both of us across lines we could not cross alone, and then I added that I would be sharing a little update later that morning that meant the world to me, and I meant every word while also knowing exactly how it would land. Because anyone who wanted to pretend last night was pure individual triumph would feel a small itch under the skin reading the phrase their signatures, and anyone who had ever signed something they were not bragging about would feel it more. It was petty, and it was not petty at the same time, which is my favorite kind of move, because it lets you sleep at night. And when my mom replied with a heart, and my dad replied with a thumbs up, and Jake replied with a gif that could be read as either support or sarcasm, depending on your mood, I put my phone face down and told myself the next part had to be equally calm and equally undeniable, because baiting him into a fight today would help him and not me, and I am done helping him win easy rounds. And as I poured a second cup of coffee and opened my laptop to schedule the post I had written with a smile that did not wobble, I decided to add one more line that felt generous, while actually being razor sharp. A line about neighborhood research being smart for any buyer because the city loves surprises and none of us should get blindsided by policy, which is the kind of statement that makes reasonable people nod and makes people hiding facts feel seen. and I scheduled it to go live right after 9 because that is when our relatives wake up and start scrolling, and I sat back and let the clock move toward it with the kind of patience you learn when you had to finish homework on lunch breaks and sign your own lease without a cosigner. By the time it posted, the first comments started popping up with congratulations and curious questions that were not aimed at me, and I watched the dots dance next to Jake's name and then vanish. And for the first time in a long time, I felt the center of gravity tilt one notch back toward me, which was not the victory yet, but it was the drumroll. And as my phone buzzed with an unknown number that looked suspiciously like a realtor's office, I let it ring twice before I answered, because some moments deserve a little silence before you step into them. The number flashed again while the comments under my post stacked up like chairs after a wedding. And I let it ring through once more because I wanted a second to decide whether this was going to be one of those calls you regret answering or one of those calls you are glad you took. And then I picked up and said hello with that polite voice I use when I am not sure if I am about to be sold something or helped, and a woman introduced herself as Claire from the neighborhood board on the east side, who also does part-time work with a local realtor, and she said she was calling because my little note about doing neighborhood research had already bounced around a few family and friends circles, and someone forwarded it to her. And she wanted to make sure people had the right information and not half-baked gossip, which sounded exactly like the grown-up version of what I was trying to do, so I told her I was all for getting people the facts and that I was not trying to light a fire. I was just trying to keep people from pretending the stove was cold. She laughed in the quick, tired way people laugh when they recognize a fellow adult who has been burned before, and then she told me what I already suspected but needed to hear said out loud by someone who did not share my last name, which was that the city had, in fact, scheduled a batch of inspections tied to a brief campaign about compliance and safety around the older blocks near the project line, and that the notices were public and dull and easy to ignore, and that a handful of addresses were already flagged for a second look that could jam up anything time-sensitive, and that anyone trying to buy, sell, refinance, or renovate in that pocket needed to plan with eyes open. I asked a few questions the way a person asks when she is trying to be responsible rather than vindictive, and I took notes without embellishing anything in my head. And when she offered to send me the link to the public notice and the calendar for the board's next open meeting, I said thank you and meant it, because there is something deeply calming about facts when you have been gaslit by enthusiasm all night. And when the email landed, I read it twice and saved a copy to my drive the way my life teaches me to do with anything I might need to pull up later while a room pretends it does not exist. Here is where I admit the part that will sound cold to anyone who has never had a sibling like mine. I did not forward that link privately to Jake, and I did not text him with a friendly heads up. Because the last time I tried that during his new car phase, he called me dramatic and accused me of jinxing things, and I am done handing people free airbags when they keep flooring the gas and bragging about it. So what I did instead was the grown, careful thing that also happens to be the sharp thing, which is I went back to my post and added a calm comment that said, for anyone who is asking, here is the official notice, and I hope it helps you plan smart. And then I tagged the community board page so that the people who actually do this work could answer questions that did not belong to me, and I kept my tone so steady you could rest a glass on it. The effect was instant and slow at the same time, the way a pot looks still, and then suddenly you see the surface move, and I watched aunts and cousins and a couple of friends click and react. And I watched my mom drop a sweet comment about how proud she was of both her kids for doing big adult things, and I watched my dad type a line about diligence that made me smile, because I learned diligence by necessity while Jake learned it by lecture. And then I watched the tiny gray dots appear next to Jake's name over and over, each time blinking like a turn signal that never completes the turn. I am not going to lie and pretend my heart was made of stone. There was a small tug in my chest that wanted to soften it for him, the part of me that remembers him carrying me inside when I fell asleep on the couch during a movie when we were little. But that tug has spent years being trained by reality, and reality says that if I had made last night about me the way he made it about him, my parents would have told me to be gracious, so me being gracious today meant telling the truth cleanly and letting grown people handle the consequences of their choices, and if the truth was inconvenient, that was not a flaw in my delivery. To keep myself from spiraling into old patterns, I took one more step that was both strategic and kind, because I am allowed to be both, and I texted my cousin Monica, the one who has been saving up to buy her first condo and had been eyeing that same area because the prices look friendly until you read why they look friendly, and I told her to wait and watch the board calendar. And I told her I would go with her to a meeting if she wanted company, and she wrote back a string of grateful words. That made me feel like at least one person in the family saw what I was trying to do, which is shift attention from spectacle to substance. Then, because I knew how the next move would be counted and I wanted it counted on my scoreboard rather than his, I opened my LinkedIn and posted the clean, unmessy announcement I had been sitting on for weeks, that I had accepted an offer in a new city with a company that valued the stubborn kind of worker who finished school while paying her own bills, and I wrote it like a quiet thank you note to everyone who kept me focused rather than a victory dance for strangers. And within minutes, former classmates and managers chimed in with the kind of validation that does not need exclamation marks to matter, and what that did, aside from making me breathe easier, was give my parents a script they could repeat when neighbors asked what I was up to, a script that did not include my brother. The calls from Jake started coming faster after that, one after another like impatient taps on a fish tank, and I let them roll to voicemail while I edited one last line under my original Facebook post. A line that said I would be at the open meeting next week to learn more, and that anyone thinking about buying there might want to come too. And I meant it, because I planned to show up with a notebook and a list of questions like the adult I am. But I also knew what that line would do, which is make the casual gossipers turn into actual readers and make the loud brag feel suddenly very small under the weight of a calendar date you cannot charm. By the time I finally pressed the side button on my phone and watched the missed call counter climb, I could hear my door buzzer in my memory from all the times Jake has shown up to talk me down when he is in a jam and wants me to fix something quietly. And I thought about opening the door this time just to see his face when I told him that grown decisions have grown consequences, but I did not move, because he had chosen a stage last night and I was choosing a paper trail today, and paper trails do not argue, they just exist. I put the phone face down, took a breath that did not shake, and told myself that the next ring I answered would be the one that proved this was not a tantrum but a plan, and as if the universe were taking cues for once, my screen lit up with my mother's name instead of his, which meant the message had landed in the place it needed to land, and I tapped accept and said hi mom in the most even voice I own, ready to hear whether she was going to scold me for stirring the pot or ask me to send her the link again so she could understand what she had signed. My mother did not waste time with pleasantries because that is not her style when she is worried about appearances. So instead of asking how I slept or whether I had eaten, she went straight to the point and asked in that careful voice she uses when she is trying not to sound like she is taking sides whether my post was really necessary and whether I was sure I wanted to invite neighborhood politics into what should have been a simple family celebration, and I listened without interrupting. Because I've learned that letting people hear themselves is sometimes the only way to keep the conversation from turning into a wrestling match, and when she finally ran out of steam, I told her, calmly and without any sugar, that the information was public, that I had not said anything untrue, and that if we are going to celebrate grown decisions, then we also have to accept grown disclosures, which includes the boring reality that cities change rules and buyers have to pay attention, and I think the word boring helped because it made the whole thing sound less like a feud and more like homework, which she respects in theory even if not in practice. She asked me if this was about jealousy and I said no, that this was about balance, and I added that I had my own news which I had already posted with all the restraint the family keeps claiming they want from me. And I could hear her tapping keys as she opened my update and read the lines about a new role in a new city and a timeline defined by a start date that made everything suddenly real. And her voice softened without actually apologizing as she said she was proud of me and that she hoped I would come by for dinner before I moved, and then she said the sentence that told me my post had landed exactly where it needed to land, which was that she and my father were going to speak with Jake because they did not like learning about the inspection schedule from cousins in the group chat, and I let that sit because consequences mean more when they are not wrapped in my commentary. After we hung up, I watched my notifications roll in like a tide that had chosen my shore for once. And the reaction was a clean split between the friends who wanted to celebrate the job and the relatives who wanted to know everything about the community meeting and whether the rumors were real. And because I refused to be the person who stirs and walks away, I did what I always do when I am accused of being dramatic, which is I turned down the temperature by offering facts. So I added a comment that thanked people for the congratulations, repeated that I was simply sharing the public calendar for anyone curious, and that I believed in doing due diligence before making big purchases because the cost of pretending not to know something is always higher than the cost of reading the fine print, which is a sentence I wish someone had said out loud in my house years ago. The first call from Jake came in mid-sentence while I was typing that comment, and even though my thumb hovered over the answer button for a beat because muscle memory is a powerful thing, I let it go to voicemail, and I finished my thought, posted it, and then opened his message, which was a fast stream of words that read like he was half whispering and half yelling, asking what the hell I thought I was doing and why I would try to tank his moment, and then pivoting to a plea that I take the post down because people were asking questions he did not have answers to yet, and I sat with that for a second because somewhere under the swagger there was genuine fear, and I am not a monster, but I am also not a doormat anymore. So I replied with one line that said the truth is not an attack and that if he needed help preparing for questions the board would be more useful than I would, and then I put my phone face down and opened my laptop so I would stop reading the same sentences over and over like a song you hate but cannot stop humming. Because revenge that actually works does not leave scorch marks on your own side, I took the rest of the morning and made the move I had promised myself I would make as soon as I had leverage that did not look like a weapon, and I wrote a short, generous post addressed to my parents on the family page, the kind of message you write when you want to make something obvious without sounding like you are dragging anyone, where I thanked them for believing in both their kids and for backing us through big steps even when the paperwork felt heavy, and where I said I had learned from them to check everything twice and to never be embarrassed about asking questions before signing. And then I ended with a note that I would be at the open meeting next week and anyone who wanted company could sit with me, which was both an invitation and a mirror, because if they showed up it meant they were willing to know. And if they did not show up it meant they preferred the story to the facts. The reaction from extended family was immediate and weirdly wholesome, because plenty of people like pretending they belong to sensible clans even when the group chat says otherwise. And a couple of uncles I rarely hear from dropped comments about smart planning and community pride, while my cousin Monica messaged to say she had roped 2 coworkers into coming with us, and my aunt, the one with the sharp instincts, texted me a screenshot of a side chat where a neighbor had asked whether anyone else had noticed the inspection vans on their block this past week, and I felt something unclench in my chest because the conversation had moved from gossip to logistics, which is where I live and where Jake is weakest. When he called again I answered, not to be kind but to be clear, and his opening was the same defensive swagger I have heard my whole life, a recital of how everyone was overreacting and how I was making him look irresponsible. And I let him burn through it until he finally asked what I wanted, and for the first time in years I said exactly what I wanted without blunting it, which was respect for my work and honesty about his support. And I told him that if he ever again hijacked a milestone of mine I would not use hints next time, I would use receipts, and that if he wanted me to help him prepare for the inspection I would do it as a consultant with boundaries, not as his cleanup crew. And the silence on the other end was long enough for me to wonder whether he had hung up, and then he said he would think about it, which is the closest thing to accountability I have ever heard from him. I ended the call before he could pivot back to excuses, and I went back to my messages where a former manager had offered to introduce me to a colleague in the new city who could help me find a short-term rental close to the office so I would not be scrambling. And I took the call because building my life is the point and not just messing with his, and while I was discussing neighborhoods that actually matched my salary and my calendar, a new notification popped up from the community board with an update that the city had added 1 more block to the inspection list, and the map pin slid closer to my brother's street by a few houses, and I knew in that moment that I did not need to push any harder because reality was going to do the rest for me. By lunchtime, my parents had texted a neutral message about wanting everyone to come over that evening to talk calmly, which is the family equivalent of sending up a flare. And, while part of me braced for the usual dynamic where I am asked to be the bigger person yet again, another part of me recognized that the map had already tilted, and that the only question left was whether I would walk into their living room with the same quiet control I had built all morning or whether I would let old habits drag me back into proving my case, and as I closed my laptop and grabbed my keys, I promised myself I would do the one thing that scares my brother more than any hint on social media, which is keep my voice even while I make it very clear that I am done playing small. I walked into my parents' living room with the same calm I had practiced all morning, because I knew if I let even one old reflex steer the conversation, we would end up exactly where we always end up, with me being told to be gracious and Jake being told to be patient. So instead of greeting the furniture and the ghosts of past arguments, I said hello, sat down, and put a neat stack of papers on the coffee table, which immediately changed my mother's posture and made my father take off his glasses the way he does when he knows this is not going to be a casual chat, and Jake, who was already leaning in his usual way like he owns a room by tilting his chair, rolled his eyes and said I had turned a family dinner into a circus. And I told him very clearly that what turned it into a circus was his decision to stand on my cake and do a little routine. My mother started in with the tone that asks everyone to be kind, and I said I was being kind, which is why everything in the stack was public and factual and quiet, and then I walked them through it. Not with a flourish, but with the same steadiness I used to explain a project plan at work, starting with the community board notice that outlined inspections and timelines. Then the lender's language about cosigner liability that my mother had never read, even though her name sits next to my brother's like a second seatbelt that will tighten around her if anything jerks. Then the calendar invite for the meeting I would be attending, because I am done pretending grown decisions are none of my business when my family puts its signature on them. And I kept my voice even while Jake did his exaggerated sighs, and my father looked like he wanted to fix it with a handshake. When they had finished flipping pages and pretending the words were slippery, I put one more sheet on top. A simple letter I had drafted with a template I found from a consumer law clinic that basically said our parents would not co-sign for any future loans, and that the current co-sign would be released by refinance as soon as Jake met the lender's reserve and inspection requirements, and I explained that I was not trying to play lawyer, I was trying to make a boundary visible, because invisible boundaries are easy to trample when charm is involved. And I told them that if they signed it, we could walk to the notary at the shipping store down the street and tuck it in a folder at home as a quiet line in the sand. And my mother looked at my father. And my father looked at the inspection language again, and for once nobody asked me if I was overreacting. Jake did what Jake always does when cornered, which is try to redirect the movie. So he said the real issue here was that I had embarrassed him online, and I said the real issue was that he had embarrassed me in person and expected me to clap. And then I did the thing he never expects, which is I offered him a way to keep his pride without letting him off the hook, and I slid my phone across the table and showed him a short paragraph I had written that he could post in the family group and on his page, a paragraph that thanked our parents for their help, acknowledged that he was learning a lot, and said he welcomed honest questions about the neighborhood because being a good neighbor includes being transparent. And I told him that if he posted that today I would stop commenting, I would let the board do its job, and I would not mention the inspection again in public, but if he did not, I would simply continue to point people to the same public information every time he tried to sell them a story that left out the parts that matter, and the silence after that offer was the first real silence I had heard from him since we were children. My father, who hates public anything, cleared his throat and said that sounded fair. My mother nodded in the small way she nods when she is both relieved and annoyed, and Jake said he would not be bullied, and I said that was fine because I was not a bully, I was a mirror. And he could choose what he wanted to see, and then I took my phone back, stood up, and said I had one more thing to add before I left, which was that my relocation package was finalized that morning and I had signed a lease near my new office without asking anyone to vouch for me, and I said it the way you tell someone you bought groceries, because I wanted them to feel the weight of how normal it is for an adult to do a thing without making it someone else's liability. And I slid a copy of my lease confirmation onto the stack, neat as a receipt. The next part is the part one wish I could bottle and hand to every younger version of myself and of anyone who grew up in a house where loudness passed for leadership, because my parents signed the letter right there. Not with ceremony, but with the kind of tired relief you see when people finally admit the obvious, and my mother said she did not realize how exposed they were, and my father said he was proud of me for making a plan, and Jake, who had been glaring at his phone as if he could burn a hole in it, typed and retyped something and finally posted the paragraph I had given him, word for word, with a line at the end about appreciating my reminder to read the fine print. And I could almost hear the group chat inhale as the notification popped up on everyone's screen. I did not gloat because gloating is cheap, and I did not hug anyone because I did not want the moment to turn into a photo. I wanted it to sit like a new piece of furniture nobody can pretend is not taking up space, so I gathered my papers. Told my parents I would send them the folder digitally for their records. Told Jake that if he wanted help with the inspection checklist, I would email him a template as a favor to our future holidays, and then I left before the old script could spool back up and cast me as the one who goes soft at the last second. By the time I reached my car, my phone was already lighting up with messages, the best kind, the kind that do not sound like applause or pity, the kind that sound like respect, and there was one from my aunt that said finally. There was one from Monica that said she had a seat saved for me at the meeting. There was one from my mother with a photo of my degree hung in their hallway where Jake's framed sports clippings used to be, which made me smile in a way that did not ache. And then there was a string of missed calls from Jake because the post had done exactly what it was supposed to do. It had deflated the balloon without popping it, and now he wanted to renegotiate feelings he had never learned to name. I did pick up once, not to negotiate but to make the last move clean, and when he started to say he felt set up I told him no, he felt seen, and that it was new and uncomfortable and survivable. And that if he wanted someone to blame, he could blame the bank for writing clear documents, and the city for posting public calendars, and me for finally refusing to shrink. And I told him something else that matters more than any clever one-liner, which is that he does not get to decide when my wins are worth celebrating, and I do not owe him my silence to keep his stories pretty. And then I wished him luck on the inspection, and said I would see him at the meeting if he chose to show up like an adult. The last thing I did that day, before I turned my phone over and let the world scroll without me for a while, was post my own final announcement, short and unshowy, that I was grateful for the new role, that I was moving on a date my company had set, that I would not be available for cosigns or rescues because my energy was spoken for, and that I would be back to visit for dinners that actually remained dinners, and I pressed send and felt the door click behind me, not slammed, just closed. Firm and simple, and whether Jake's inspection passes or fails or drifts into some drawn-out saga is now his to manage without turning my milestones into a stage, which is the whole point, because I did not just get even, I got out. And that is the win I wanted all along.